Most encounters begin the same way. A quiet road, a stretch of forest, a late hour when the world feels briefly empty. Someone notices movement at the edge of their headlights. Something standing where no person should be. Too tall, too still, upright but wrong. For centuries, people across different cultures and continents have described the same unsettling shape. They have struggled to explain it. Some called it myth. Others called it madness. A few wrote it into court records, police files, and personal journals. This is not a story about belief. It is a record of what has been seen and what remains unexplained. Before we begin, I would like you to tell me where you are tuning in from. And if you like our stories, drop a like, hit the subscribe button, and share our videos. The Night Encounter. October nights in rural Wisconsin are quiet in a way cities never manage. Roads stretch without streetlights. Forests close in tightly on both sides. At 1:30 in the morning, there is very little movement. No traffic, no pedestrians, no reason to slow down. Lori Drizzy was driving home from her shift managing a local bar. She had taken Bray Road countless times before. It was familiar, predictable, a straight stretch of pavement cutting through farmland and tree line. Her headlights caught something on the roadside. At first, she assumed it was roadkill. Deer were common in the area. So were dogs that strayed too far from nearby farms. The shape was large and hunched, turned away from the road, positioned close enough to the pavement that she eased off the accelerator. As she passed, she glanced again. The shape was not lying down. It was kneeling. His back was broad. His shoulders were raised. Its arms, not forelegs, were bent at the elbows and extended forward. Something was held between them. She could not see clearly what it was. The posture suggested feeding. She slowed further. Then the head turned. Drizzy later described the face as wolf-like, elongated, fur-covered. The eyes reflected her headlights. Not a brief flash, but a sustained shine. The body remained still as the head rotated toward her. They were close. Less than 6 feet apart as she passed. The figure did not lunge. It did not run. It did not vocalize. It simply watched. Drizzy accelerated and did not look back. She reached home shaken, uncertain how to describe what she had seen. She did not contact police that night. She did not tell friends immediately. The experience felt difficult to frame even to herself. There was no obvious category to place it in. Years later, when she did speak publicly, she would say the same thing she said at the time. It was not a wolf, and it was not a man. She was not the first person to report something like this in the area, and she would not be the last. Across different decades, in different countries, people describe encounters that begin the same way. A solitary witness, a rural setting, low light, a moment when something appears at the edge of perception and does not behave as expected. Drivers report slowing down, expecting to see an animal. Hunters report raising rifles, then lowering them. Walkers report freezing in place, unsure whether to move closer or retreat. The descriptions vary in detail, but certain elements repeat. The figure is large, larger than a typical wolf, larger than a dog, often estimated at 6 to 7 feet when upright. It moves or stands on 2 legs. Its head resembles a canine, a long snout, ears positioned high on the skull, eyes that reflect light. The arms are described as muscular, jointed like a human's, ending in hands or claws capable of grasping. The posture is wrong enough to arrest attention, but stable enough to suggest control. In many reports, the encounter lasts longer than a fleeting glimpse. 30 seconds, 45 seconds, full minute, long enough for witnesses to register details, and long enough for uncertainty to set in. People often say the same thing afterward. They know what a bear looks like. They know what a wolf looks like. They know what a man looks like. This was none of those. In some cases, the figure retreats into the forest. In others, it remains still until the witness leaves. Occasionally, it crosses a road. Occasionally, it vanishes without obvious movement, as if swallowed by darkness. Physical evidence is rare, but not entirely absent. Oversized footprints have been reported in soft ground. Scratches on vehicles, injured livestock, claw marks inconsistent with known predators. Just enough to be noted, not enough to be decisive. What makes these encounters difficult to categorize is not their drama, but their restraint. There is no consistent pattern of attack, no pursuit, no repeated vocalization. Often there is simply observation on both sides. Witnesses frequently describe embarrassment after the fact. Many delay reporting. Some never do. The fear is not only of what they saw, but of how it will be received. They are asked about lighting, about alcohol, about stress, about imagination. Some withdraw their statements. Others stand by them quietly for decades. The term werewolf is rarely used by witnesses themselves. That word usually comes later, applied by investigators, journalists, or readers searching for a label. Those who encounter the figure tend to avoid naming it. They focus instead on posture, on distance, on how long it lasted, on the feeling that accompanies recognition without understanding. A sense that something was present that did not fit. These encounters are not evenly distributed. They appear in clusters, certain roads, certain forests, certain regions that produce reports years apart, sometimes generations apart, with little in between. Bray Road would become one of those places. So would parts of France, Germany, the Appalachian region, and rural areas across North America. The environments share similarities. Dense woodland, limited artificial light, low population density, margins, places where human activity thins out. In these places, encounters do not announce themselves. They interrupt routine, a drive home, a night shift, a walk between buildings. The witnesses are not looking for anything unusual. That is often emphasized. The encounter intrudes. What follows is rarely clarity. Instead, it is a long period of quiet uncertainty. People replay what they saw, adjust details, question memory, try different explanations, settle on none. The record of these encounters does not read like mythology. It reads like notes taken by people who were briefly forced into an unfamiliar category of experience and then returned to their lives. Over time, others would begin to collect these accounts, some skeptically, some reluctantly, some methodically. Patterns would be noted, comparisons drawn, explanations would be proposed. But the encounters themselves would remain largely unchanged in how they were described. Always upright, always close enough to see, always just long enough to be remembered. The road where Lori and Drizzy slowed her car still exists. The forest line has not moved much. The night still settles the same way. Nothing marks the spot. There rarely is anything to mark. The encounter ends. The witness leaves, and whatever stood at the roadside is no longer there. And then another person saw it. A single encounter can be dismissed. A mistake, a trick of light, fatigue, memory adjusting itself after the fact. Two encounters begin to complicate things. They arrive separated by time, sometimes by geography. Different people, different circumstances, and yet the details begin to align in ways that are difficult to ignore. In 1936, more than 50 years before the Bray Road sightings would draw attention, a night watchman named Mark Shackleman was working at St. Coletta School near Jefferson, Wisconsin. His job required him to patrol open fields after dark. The land bordered wooded areas and old Native American burial mounds. The nights were quiet, familiar. Shackleman noticed something digging in the field. From a distance, it appeared to be an animal, a large one. He assumed it was a wolf. As he approached, the shape rose up. It stood on two legs. Shackleman later described it as over 6 feet tall, covered in thick hair, with a wolf-like face. He noticed its arms first. They were long and muscular, moving independently rather than like forelegs. The eyes reflected light. There was a strong odor which he compared to rotting meat. He backed away slowly. The figure did not chase him. It simply watched. Shackleman never reported the incident widely. He told a few people. The account sat quietly for decades. Then others began to report similar encounters. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, reports from rural Wisconsin increased. Not just one or two, but enough to form a loose pattern. People driving alone at night, farmers checking property lines, teenagers cutting through back roads. Each believed at first that they were seeing a person or an animal. Each realized at close range that it was neither. Dory Stein Gibson was driving down Bray Road when she noticed a figure kneeling near the roadside. She assumed it was a person at first. The posture suggested someone crouched over something on the ground. She slowed. As she drew closer, she saw hair covering the body. Grayish-brown, thick. The face had a snout. The ears were pointed. The eyes reflected yellow gold in her headlights. The arms were bent like a man's arms, not angled like an animal's forelegs. The legs were folded beneath it, as if kneeling. She was close enough to see muscle definition. The encounter lasted approximately 45 seconds. Gibson did not scream. She did not stop. She continued driving, trying to understand what she had just passed. She later said the detail that stayed with her was the posture. It was not unstable. It did not wobble or struggle to remain upright. It appeared comfortable that way. Other witnesses would say the same. Scott Bray, a dairy farmer whose name would later become associated with the road itself, reported seeing a large, dog-like figure moving upright near his property. He found footprints afterward, 4 to 5 inches wide, deep impressions in soft soil. A high school student named Tom Brichta reported colliding with something while driving. He described an impact unlike hitting a deer. He felt resistance. His car was damaged. Another witness claimed the creature attempted to enter her home. She heard scratching at the door. Later, she found marks inconsistent with known animals. A nearby horse was found injured, with a long gash across its back. The incidents did not occur all at once. They were spread out. Weeks, months, years. But the descriptions remained consistent. The height estimates varied slightly. The fur color ranged from gray to brown. Some described glowing eyes. Others described eyes that reflected light normally. What did not change was the shape. Upright, broad shoulders, canine head, human-like arms. The witnesses did not know each other. They did not coordinate their accounts. Many were reluctant to speak at all. When asked why they eventually came forward, some said they did so only after hearing someone else describe the same thing. Recognition works both ways. Similar patterns appear outside Wisconsin. In Michigan, hunters reported seeing a tall, fur-covered figure standing near tree lines before retreating into dense forest. In Pennsylvania, a driver reported braking suddenly after seeing what he thought was a man in a fur coat crossing the road on two legs. At closer range, he realized the head was not human. In Ohio, railroad workers reported a large bipedal figure pacing alongside tracks at night, matching speed briefly before veering into the trees. In Louisiana, rural residents reported encounters along bayous, upright movement, canine features, the same pause, the same stillness. In many cases, the witnesses initially believed they were seeing a person in costume. That assumption often lasted only seconds. There is a point in many accounts where recognition breaks down. The body moves like a man. The head does not. The face looks like a wolf. The posture does not. That contradiction is what witnesses struggle to articulate. It is also what remains remarkably stable across reports. The encounters rarely escalate. There is no consistent aggression, no pursuit, no clear intent. Instead, there is proximity, close enough to see, close enough to remember. Some encounters occur at a distance, others at the length of a car, a few at arm's reach. The closer encounters tend to unsettle witnesses the most, not because of fear alone, but because of the clarity involved. Misidentification becomes harder at close range. So does dismissal. The reports do not describe chaos. They describe interruption, a routine broken, a moment inserted where something does not belong. The witnesses leave. The figure remains, retreats, or disappears. And then another person somewhere else sees it too. Years later, miles away, the same shape, the same posture, the same inability to explain it cleanly. At some point, these accounts began to be collected. Journalists, folklorists, local officials. Files were opened. Notes were taken. Some were labeled cautiously, others not at all. One humane officer in Wisconsin reportedly kept a manila folder simply marked werewolf, not because he believed in folklore, because he did not know what else to call it. The accumulation of encounters does not form a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It forms a pattern, and patterns invite questions, not about belief, but about repetition. When different people, separated by time and place, describe the same unlikely shape, the question shifts. It becomes less about whether any single witness is correct, and more about why the same description keeps returning, again, and again, and again, when the sightings had names. Long before there were police reports or newspaper headlines, there were accounts written in the margins of history, not as myths, not as stories told for entertainment, but as explanations for events that had no other language available to them. In medieval Europe, forests were not symbols. They were boundaries. Beyond the last field and the last road, visibility dropped, sound changed, and control ended. Most people lived and died without ever venturing far into wooded land. When something emerged from those spaces, it was noticed. Reports from the late Middle Ages describe encounters that feel familiar. Travelers attacked on roads at dusk. Shepherds finding livestock mutilated in ways that did not resemble wolf kills. Villagers reporting a figure seen moving upright along forest edges at night. At first, these were treated as animal problems. Wolves were hunted. Traps were set. Bounties were offered. When the events continued, the language changed. In France, Germany, and parts of Switzerland, witnesses began describing something that was not simply a wolf. It moved differently. It appeared larger. It showed unusual boldness. It did not always flee when confronted. The word loup-garou appeared in French records, werewolf in German ones, not as poetic terms, but as descriptors for a specific type of threat. In 1573, near the town of Dole in France, villagers reported repeated attacks on children near wooded areas. Witnesses claimed to have seen a wolf-like creature behaving in ways wolves did not, standing upright, watching, remaining close to human settlements. A man named Gilles Garnier was eventually accused. He lived alone near the forest. He was seen near the site of one of the attacks. Witnesses testified that they had seen a wolf attack a child and then found a man standing over the body. Garnier confessed to the killings and claimed he used an ointment that transformed him into a wolf. He was executed. The confession satisfied the court. It did not end the reports. In Germany, similar accounts emerged. In 1589, Peter Stubb was accused of killing livestock and people near the town of Bedburg. Witnesses described attacks attributed to a creature that behaved unlike known animals. Stubb confessed under interrogation, claiming a pact with the devil and the use of a magical belt that allowed him to become a wolf. His execution was public and severe. His head was displayed atop a wolf's body as a warning. The warning did not work. Across Europe, between the early 1500s and the mid-1600s, thousands of people were accused of werewolf-related crimes. The numbers vary by source, but the pattern is consistent. Courts treated these cases as responses to real events, not symbolic acts. People were arrested because livestock was found torn apart, because children disappeared, because witnesses reported seeing something that could not be easily explained. The trials followed familiar legal procedures for the time. Testimony was gathered. Evidence was presented. Confessions were extracted. Some confessions were clearly the result of torture. Others were not. In several cases, courts ruled that the accused were mentally ill rather than malevolent. This was unusual for the period. It suggests uncertainty, not certainty. What mattered to the authorities was not belief in transformation. It was containment. Something was happening. Someone was responsible. Action had to be taken. The term werewolf functioned less as a supernatural claim and more as a placeholder for the unknown. Notably, descriptions from this period rarely focus on dramatic transformation. Instead, they focus on encounters, attacks, sightings, proximity. People described seeing a wolf stand upright, or a man move with animal posture, or a figure that shifted in appearance under different lighting. The details varied, but the core contradiction remained. Human, animal, both, neither. These accounts were recorded by clerics, magistrates, and chroniclers who were not inclined toward fantasy. Many were uncomfortable with what they were documenting. Some used careful language. Others avoided detail altogether. By the late 1600s, attitudes began to change. Enlightenment thinking reframed many earlier phenomena as superstition or hysteria. Medical explanations replaced spiritual ones. Courts became reluctant to prosecute cases involving alleged transformations. The trials stopped. The sightings did not. Reports continued, but the language shifted again. Without courts willing to hear them, people stopped framing encounters as crimes. They became rumors, then folklore, then stories told cautiously. In rural areas, names persisted. Local terms, regional labels, none standardized. In Scandinavia, Accounts described men who donned wolf skins and attacked travelers. In Eastern Europe, stories described figures that walked like men but hunted like animals. In parts of Italy, shepherds spoke of upright wolves seen near mountain passes. These accounts were rarely centralized. They existed in local memory, passed quietly rather than formally recorded. The naming of the phenomenon did not create it, followed it. People gave names to what they kept encountering because names offer a way to speak without explaining. The shift from incident to myth did not happen overnight. It happened as institutions withdrew from the problem. Once courts stopped listening, the responsibility to explain fell back onto communities. And communities do what they can. They tell stories. They warn each other. They avoid certain roads. They don't go out alone at night. The upright shape remained. It did not require belief to persist. It required only witnesses. By the time the modern world emerged, complete with scientific classification and electric light, the old names had become loaded with assumption. Werewolf no longer meant an unidentified threat. It meant folklore, but beneath the word remained a record of encounters that never fully resolved. What people saw had names once. Those names changed. The descriptions did not. And as the centuries passed, the question quietly shifted. Not whether people believed in werewolves, but why the same sightings kept returning, even after the names were supposed to be gone. The years people were arrested for what was seen. When sightings multiplied and fear spread, communities did not treat the phenomenon as legend. They treated it as a problem that required intervention. Roads were avoided. Fields went unattended. Children were kept indoors. Livestock losses mounted. Local authorities were pressured to act. In early modern Europe, acting meant investigation. Between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, courts across France, Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Eastern Europe began opening cases not against wolves, but against people accused of being responsible for attacks attributed to something wolf-like. These were not casual accusations. They followed patterns of reported incidents. A child disappears near the forest edge. A shepherd is found mauled. Livestock is torn apart in ways locals say wolves do not usually manage. Witnesses report seeing a large wolf behaving unusually, standing upright, lingering near villages, showing no fear of humans. When hunts failed to stop the events, suspicion shifted. Who lived closest to the forest? Who was seen nearby? Who behaved strangely? Arrests followed sightings. In 1598, in the French region of Angers, villagers reported repeated attacks on livestock and children. Witnesses described a large wolf that approached settlements and did not flee. Eventually, a man named Jacques Roulet was discovered naked in the forest, covered in blood, near the mutilated body of a child. Roulet claimed he had attacked the child while in the form of a wolf. Unlike many others, the court did not immediately execute him. Instead, judges ruled that he was mentally ill. He was committed rather than burned. This decision was rare. It suggests the court was uncertain, not about whether something violent was occurring, but about how to explain it. In other cases, courts were less hesitant. In 1603, near Bordeaux, a man named Jean Grenier was accused after multiple children reported being attacked by a wolf-like creature that walked on two legs. Grenier openly claimed to be a werewolf. He described roaming the countryside at night, attacking children near the edge of villages. The court again ruled him mentally unstable. He was confined rather than executed. Yet the attacks he described were real. The injuries were documented. The fear was not imagined. These cases sit uncomfortably between explanation and uncertainty. Authorities were attempting to map human responsibility onto events that did not behave like ordinary crime. In many regions, however, the response was harsher. In Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, executions followed confessions that were extracted under torture. Accused individuals described belts, ointments, or packs that allowed transformation. Courts accepted these statements not as metaphor, but as mechanism. The important point is not whether these confessions were true. It is why courts believed they were necessary. Authorities were responding to repeated incidents that could not be stopped by conventional means. Wolves had been hunted extensively. Traps had been set. Bounties had been paid. Still, the reports continued. From the court's perspective, eliminating a suspected human agent was a rational escalation. These trials were not fringe events. They involved magistrates, clerics, physicians, and legal scholars. Detailed records were kept. Sentences were debated. The charge was often not being a werewolf, but murder, cannibalism, or witchcraft, with the werewolf designation functioning as an explanation for how those crimes were committed. In some regions, hundreds of cases were tried over decades. In others, only a handful. What united them was not belief in mythology, but institutional urgency. Something was killing people. Something was being seen. Something was not stopping. By the mid-1600s, attitudes began to shift. Medical thinkers proposed that some accused individuals were delusional rather than supernatural. Others argued that witnesses were misinterpreting animal attacks. Gradually, courts grew reluctant to prosecute such cases. Executions declined. Trials stopped. The legal system withdrew from the problem. But the withdrawal did not coincide with resolution. Reports of upright wolves, wolfmen, or human-shaped canines continued to appear in private letters, local chronicles, and later newspapers. What changed was not what people reported seeing, but how institutions responded. Once courts stopped listening, incidents were no longer processed as crimes. They became stories, then folklore, then curiosities. But the underlying events did not vanish. This is an important distinction. The end of prosecutions is often mistaken for the end of the phenomenon. It was not. It was the end of one method of control. Authorities stopped arresting people for what was seen not because sightings ceased, but because the framework for addressing them collapsed. Without a legal mechanism, there was nothing to do but record, dismiss, or ignore. In some regions, officials still attempted investigations. Hunters were sent. Patrols increased. Warnings were issued. Results were inconsistent. Sometimes nothing further occurred. Sometimes the reports resumed months or years later. The arrest records show something crucial. For over a century, sightings and attacks were taken seriously enough to justify imprisonment, torture, and execution. Entire communities believed action was necessary. That level of response does not arise from isolated rumor. It arises from repetition, from fear sustained over time, from events that refuse to resolve. When the courts stopped intervening, the responsibility shifted again, this time to individuals. People learned to keep quiet. They learned not to report. They learned that naming what they saw could be dangerous. The phenomenon did not disappear. It went underground. And there, away from courtrooms and gallows, it waited to be seen again, by someone alone at night, on a road where no one was supposed to be. The beasts that triggered hunts. Most encounters described so far ended the same way. A witness saw something. The moment passed. The figure retreated or vanished. Life resumed, altered only by memory. But there were periods when the encounters did not stop. They escalated. When sightings turned into repeated deaths, authorities responded not with courts, but with organized pursuit. The most well-documented of these episodes occurred in rural France in the mid-18th century, in a region known as Gavaudan. In the summer of 1764, reports began coming in from villages scattered across the countryside. People were being attacked while tending livestock or walking between settlements. The victims were often young. Many were partially consumed. The injuries were severe, focused on the throat and face. Witnesses described the attacker as wolf-like, but larger. Some said it moved differently. Some said it showed no fear when confronted. At first, local officials assumed an unusually aggressive wolf was responsible. Wolves were common in France at the time. Bounties were posted. Hunters were dispatched. The attacks continued. By the end of the year, dozens were dead. Eyewitnesses began reporting details that complicated the explanation. The animal appeared reddish in color. It sometimes attacked in daylight. It did not retreat when fired upon. In several cases, it approached groups of people. Survivors described it as massive, with a broad chest and powerful limbs. Some said it stood upright briefly while attacking. Others said it circled victims deliberately, as if assessing. King Louis XV was eventually forced to intervene. Professional hunters were sent from Paris. Soldiers were deployed. Hundreds of wolves were killed across the region. One particularly large wolf was shot and presented at court as the culprit. The attacks did not stop. Parish records continued to list deaths attributed to the same unknown creature. Local clergy recorded burials. Medical examiners noted injuries inconsistent with typical wolf attacks. Fear spread beyond Gavaudan. Travelers avoided the region. Rumors circulated across France. This was no longer a local problem. In 1767, a local hunter named Jean Chastel shot a large animal during a hunt. Accounts differ on the details. Some say he used silver bullets. Others omit that entirely. What is consistent is what followed. After Chastel's shot, the attack stopped. Completely. No further deaths attributed to the beast were recorded. The animal's body was examined by multiple witnesses. Some described it as an unusually large wolf. Others noted strange proportions. The remains were eventually lost to time. What remains are the records, military involvement, royal correspondence, parish death registries, contemporary reports. Something killed between 60 and 100 people over 3 years. Whatever it was survived sustained hunting pressure. It ended only after a specific kill. Gavaudan was not unique. Earlier and later outbreaks show similar patterns. In parts of Germany during the 1500s, villages reported clusters of livestock killings followed by human deaths. Organized hunts were launched. Wolves were killed. The incidents continued. In some cases, accused humans were executed. In others, nothing conclusive was found. In Eastern Europe, forests near trade routes became associated with repeated attacks. Travelers reported seeing large upright figures near roads at night. Armed escorts were employed. Attacks sometimes ceased, sometimes resumed. What distinguishes these periods from isolated sightings is scale. Multiple deaths, repeated attacks, sustained fear. Communities do not organize hunts lightly. Hunts cost money. They divert labor. They require coordination. They happen when something persists. Authorities of the time were experienced with predators. Wolves, bears, and boars were familiar threats. Their behavior was documented. Their limits were known. The creatures described in these outbreaks violated expectations. They attacked during daylight. They approached groups. They survived injuries that should have been fatal. They operated in the same areas repeatedly. Hunters reported difficulty tracking them. Footprints appeared and vanished. Trails ended abruptly. Some accounts describe the animal moving differently than wolves, bounding upright for short distances, or standing to assess its surroundings. Not all reports agree. What agrees is the response. Escalation, more men, more weapons, broader sweeps. In some cases, the escalation worked. In others, it did not. When attacks stopped, there was rarely consensus on why. Sometimes a body was found, sometimes not. Sometimes the region was simply abandoned long enough for fear to dissipate. These episodes challenge simple explanations. If the phenomenon were purely mythological, there would be nothing to hunt. If it were purely criminal, arrests would have ended it. If it were purely animal, known patterns would apply. Instead, the response sits in between. Authorities treated the threat as physical and external. They mobilized resources accordingly. They documented outcomes. And then, in most cases, they moved on. The hunts ended. The records closed. But the idea that something capable of triggering that level of response once existed did not disappear. In later centuries, as firearms improved and forests shrank, large-scale outbreaks became rarer. Sightings replaced attacks. Encounters replaced deaths. But the shape described during those hunts, large, wolf-like, occasionally upright, continued to appear in witness accounts long after organized hunts were no longer possible. The escalation phase passed. What remained were memories of something that once required entire regions to mobilize against it. Not a rumor, not a metaphor, an unknown presence serious enough to force governments, militaries, and communities to act. Whatever those hunts were chasing, it was not imagined lightly. And when the hunts ended, the question they left behind did not. It simply followed the sightings into the quieter centuries that came next. When the shape crossed the ocean, by the time large-scale hunts faded from Europe, the forests themselves were changing. Roads expanded. Settlements grew. Wolves were driven back or eradicated in many regions. The sightings became less violent, less frequent, and easier to dismiss. But they did not disappear. Instead, similar accounts began appearing elsewhere. Across the Atlantic, early colonial records from North America contain descriptions that feel strangely familiar. Settlers moving inland wrote of dense forests that behaved differently at night. Sounds carried oddly. Shapes appeared where no one expected them. In the 17th and 18th centuries, frontier communities recorded attacks on livestock that did not match known predators. Some journals describe wolves that stood too tall, or beasts that watched rather than fled. These accounts were rarely formal reports. They were notes in diaries, mentions in letters, warnings passed between settlements. In many cases, colonists deferred to indigenous knowledge of the land. Indigenous communities across North America had their own stories of upright, animal-like beings encountered near forests, mountains, and river valleys. These accounts were not framed as monsters in the European sense. They were described as beings that existed at the margins, neither fully animal nor fully human. Colonial observers recorded these accounts selectively, often with skepticism, sometimes with discomfort. What matters is not how these stories were interpreted, but that similar descriptions emerged independently in unfamiliar terrain. As settlements expanded westward, reports followed. In the Appalachian region, travelers described encountering large, fur-covered figures standing near trails at night. Hunters reported seeing shapes rise on two legs before disappearing into dense tree cover. These sightings were brief, but unsettling enough to be remembered. In the Midwest, where forests met farmland, reports increased in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Farmers working late noticed movement at the edges of their fields. Night watchmen reported figures pacing along fence lines. Railroad workers saw silhouettes keeping pace with trains before vanishing into the dark. The posture was always the detail that stood out. Not quadrupedal, not human, something in between. In 1930s Wisconsin, long before Bray Road became a name, reports surfaced from rural areas near Jefferson and Elkhorn. Witnesses described tall, fur-covered figures digging in fields or standing near tree lines. These accounts did not reach national attention. They remained local, discussed quietly. Similar reports appeared in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where dense forest and limited population created conditions similar to those of old Europe. Loggers reported seeing upright shapes watching from the trees. Hunters reported following tracks that suddenly changed gait. In Pennsylvania, encounters clustered near wooded ridges and old mining roads. Drivers reported braking suddenly after mistaking an upright figure for a man standing in the road. Only at close range did the proportions become wrong. In Louisiana, sightings shifted to swampy terrain. Witnesses described tall, animal-like figures moving through marshland on two legs, waiting where wolves would not. The environment changed. The shape did not. These reports rarely used the term werewolf. The word carried baggage. It invited ridicule. Witnesses instead described what they saw as plainly as possible. A large animal standing upright. A creature with a wolf's head and a man's body. Something that watched. Local law enforcement occasionally investigated. Usually nothing was found. No tracks. No remains. No repeat incident. The cases closed quietly, but the reports accumulated. By the mid-20th century, newspapers occasionally picked up stories of wolfmen or dogmen seen in rural America. These articles were often framed lightly, placed near the back pages. Yet the witnesses quoted sounded sincere. They were not describing legends. They were describing interruptions. A drive home delayed, a hunt cut short, a routine broken. What changed in the American context was not the sightings, but the response. There were no courts to prosecute transformation, no hunts sanctioned by kings, no centralized authority to mobilize. Instead, there was skepticism. Explanations came quickly. Bears, dogs, hoaxes, misidentification. Sometimes these explanations fit. Sometimes they did not. The vastness of the land allowed encounters to remain isolated. A sighting in Michigan did not easily connect to one in Pennsylvania. Patterns took longer to emerge. When they did, they were noticed not by authorities, but by individuals willing to listen. Journalists, folklorists, local officials, people who expected to explain the reports away. What they found instead was repetition. The same posture, the same hesitation, the same reluctance to report. The Atlantic crossing did not change the phenomenon, changed the frame. Without centuries of folklore attached, witnesses described what they saw without inherited language. They focused on mechanics, not meaning. How it moved, how long it stood, how close it was. These details align more closely than the names ever did. By the late 20th century, clusters of sightings would begin to draw attention. Not because they were new, but because they were numerous enough to resist easy dismissal. Bray Road would become one of those clusters. So would parts of Michigan, Ohio, and the Appalachian foothills. The forests were different. The roads were different. The shape was the same. When something appears repeatedly in unfamiliar territory, the question is not how it arrived. It is why it looks the way it does. Across an ocean, across centuries, across cultures that shared no stories, witnesses continued to describe a figure that refused to stay categorized. Whatever crossed with humanity into new land did not need myth to survive. It only needed to be seen, and it was. The 20th century encounters. Electric light did not end the sightings. Neither did paved roads, automobiles, or mass communication. If anything, the 20th century changed only how encounters were remembered. People could now describe distances more precisely. Time could be measured. Locations could be named. What they saw remained difficult to explain. In the early decades of the century, reports came from people whose work kept them outdoors at night. Railroad employees, night watchmen, farmers, hunters. These were not people prone to imagination while indoors. Their encounters happened in open space, often at close range. In 1911, a group of miners in rural Pennsylvania reported seeing a tall, fur-covered figure standing near a service road at night. They initially assumed it was a man wearing heavy clothing. As they approached, the figure turned, revealing an elongated snout and reflective eyes. It retreated into the woods on two legs. The men did not pursue it. They did not report it formally. They spoke of it quietly afterward, unsure how to frame the experience. Similar accounts appear in logging camps across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. Loggers described seeing large upright shapes watching from tree lines. The encounters were brief, often silent. No tools were disturbed. No attacks occurred. The detail that lingered was posture. During the 1930s, reports increased in rural Wisconsin. In addition to the earlier account from a night watchman near Jefferson, farmers began reporting large tracks in fields following nights of unusual activity. Some tracks appeared canine. Others appeared almost human, but too large. In several cases, tracks were found near tree lines and vanished abruptly, as if the gait had changed. Hunters reported following prints that suggested quadrupedal movement, only to lose them where the pattern shifted. No animal was recovered. By mid-century, automobiles became the most common setting for encounters. Drivers traveling rural roads at night described sudden braking after mistaking a standing figure for a person. At closer range, the illusion broke. In Michigan in the 1950s, a truck driver reported seeing a tall, fur-covered figure crossing a logging road on two legs. The headlights illuminated the torso clearly. The head remained lowered until the last moment, when it turned. The driver did not slow. He did not return to the area afterward. In Ohio, railroad workers in the 1960s described something pacing alongside tracks for several seconds before veering into the forest. The speed matched the train briefly. The movement was upright, deliberate. Fur-covered figure standing near a service road at night. They initially assumed it was a man wearing heavy clothing. As they approached, the figure turned, revealing an elongated snout and reflective eyes. It retreated into the woods on two legs. The men did not pursue it. They did not report it formally. They spoke of it quietly afterward, unsure how to frame the experience. Similar accounts appear in logging camps across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. Loggers described seeing large upright shapes watching from tree lines. The encounters were brief, often silent. No tools were disturbed. No attacks occurred. The detail that lingered was posture. During the 1930s, reports increased in rural Wisconsin. In addition to the earlier account from a night watchman near Jefferson, farmers began reporting large tracks in fields following nights of unusual activity. Some tracks appeared canine. Others appeared almost human, but too large. In several cases, tracks were found near tree lines and vanished abruptly, as if the gait had changed. Hunters reported following prints that suggested quadrupedal movement, only to lose them where the pattern shifted. No animal was recovered. By mid-century, automobiles became the most common setting for encounters. Drivers traveling rural roads at night described sudden braking after mistaking a standing figure for a person. At closer range, the illusion broke. In Michigan in the 1950s, a truck driver reported seeing a tall, fur-covered figure crossing a logging road on two legs. The headlights illuminated the torso clearly. The head remained lowered until the last moment, when it turned. The driver did not slow. He did not return to the area afterward. In Ohio, railroad workers in the 1960s described something pacing alongside tracks for several seconds before veering into the forest. The speed matched the train briefly. The movement was upright, deliberate. The duration of many encounters made dismissal difficult. These were not fleeting shadows. They were sustained observations under headlights or moonlight, close enough to see joint movement, close enough to note muscle structure, close enough to feel watched. Law enforcement was occasionally contacted. Investigations were brief. Without evidence, cases closed. The encounters were not violent enough to demand escalation, not consistent enough to establish patterns officially. They remained in the margins. By the end of the century, something else became clear. The encounters had changed in intensity, but not in form. There were fewer attacks, fewer injuries, fewer deaths, but the shape described in earlier centuries remained. The same contradiction persisted. An animal that stood like a man, a figure that watched rather than chased, a presence that appeared briefly and left without resolution. The 20th century did not provide answers, provided better records, dates, times, names, distances, and with those details came a quieter question. If the sightings were the result of myth, why did they adapt so precisely to modern observation? Why did witnesses describe anatomy rather than magic? Why did the encounters feel less theatrical, not more? As the century ended, the reports did not crescendo. They thinned, but they did not stop. They waited for the next person driving alone at night, for the next road where headlights would catch a shape that did not belong, and for the next moment when recognition would fail, not because of darkness, but because of clarity. The clusters, individual encounters are unsettling. Clusters are harder to ignore. A cluster forms when reports appear in the same region over time, separated by months or years, sometimes decades, yet describing the same type of figure. Not a continuous presence, not a daily threat, something intermittent, returning to the same landscapes without obvious pattern. These clusters do not announce themselves immediately. They emerge slowly, often recognized only in hindsight. One of the clearest examples developed in southern Wisconsin. Long before the name Bray Road became widely known, reports surfaced from surrounding farmland and forested areas. The accounts did not arrive all at once. They trickled in, one here, another years later, then several within a short span. Different witnesses, different circumstances. The descriptions aligned. Upright posture, canine head, broad shoulders, close-range observation. The region itself offered little explanation. Rolling farmland, tree lines, quiet back roads. Nothing unique enough to suggest a singular cause. Yet people kept seeing the same thing there. Similar clustering occurred in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Sparse population, dense forest, limited road networks. Hunters, loggers, and drivers reported encounters over multiple decades. The sightings were not frequent, but they were consistent. Witnesses described tall, fur-covered figures standing near tree lines or crossing logging roads at night. Some accounts mentioned reflective eyes. Others emphasized size and posture. The encounters were brief, often silent. No clear escalation followed. No organized response. The reports remained local. In Ohio, clusters formed near railroad corridors and wooded ridges. Workers described seeing upright figures pacing alongside tracks or standing motionless near service roads. The sightings occurred years apart, sometimes reported only after someone else described something similar. In Pennsylvania, clusters appeared near rural highways that cut through forested hills. Drivers reported braking suddenly after mistaking a standing figure for a person. At closer range, the proportions failed to resolve. The witnesses did not know each other. They often lived miles apart. The connection emerged only through comparison. Clusters also appeared in the southern United States, particularly in Louisiana and parts of Arkansas. The terrain changed, swamps instead of forests, bayous instead of hills. But the descriptions remained strikingly similar. Tall, upright, animal-like. In some cases, witnesses reported the figure wading through shallow water on two legs. In others, it stood on raised ground, watching. The movement was described as controlled, not hurried. What defines a cluster is not frequency, but persistence. These regions do not produce constant sightings. They produce recurring ones. A sighting 1 year, nothing for several, then another, sometimes separated by a generation. The pattern resists simple explanation. If the sightings were caused by a single animal, it would need to survive far longer than expected. If they were caused by hoaxes, coordination across decades would be required. If misidentification were the cause, the same misidentification would need to occur repeatedly in the same areas. Clusters suggest location matters. Certain landscapes appear to facilitate encounters, not because they are inherently mysterious, but because they create conditions where unusual movement can be observed without immediate interference. Low population density, limited lighting, natural cover, regular human passage at night. These are places where something can be seen without being confronted. In several clusters, witnesses reported a shared detail, the sense that the figure was aware of being observed, but not alarmed by it. The posture was often described as relaxed, balanced. This detail appears repeatedly across regions. Another feature of clusters is witness reluctance. In many areas, people did not report encounters immediately. They waited. Some never reported at all. It was only after hearing someone else describe a similar sighting that they spoke. Recognition activates memory. A man hears a story on the radio and realizes it matches something he saw 10 years earlier. A woman reads a newspaper article and recognizes a posture she could never explain. Clusters form not only in space, but in time. One report unlocks another. Investigators who later examined these regions often noted the same thing. The witnesses were not eager. They did not seek attention. Many asked for anonymity. Some asked not to be interviewed at all. The consistency in descriptions was what drew interest. Clusters also demonstrate what the phenomenon is not. It is not an outbreak in the medical sense. It does not spread rapidly. It does not intensify until resolved. It behaves more like recurrence, appearing, disappearing, returning. In some regions, clusters fade completely. No reports for decades. In others, they linger. The reasons remain unclear. Environmental explanations are often proposed. Migration routes, animal populations, human activity patterns. Some fit, some do not. Clusters do not always align with known wildlife corridors. They do not always coincide with changes in land use. They sometimes persist even as forests shrink and roads expand. What remains consistent is description. The same shape described in Europe centuries earlier appears again in American forests. The same posture, the same ambiguity, the same lack of resolution. Clusters challenge the idea that sightings are purely subjective. If they were, they would scatter randomly. Instead, they return to the same places. They also challenge the idea that something is permanently resident. The gaps between sightings are too long. Whatever is being seen does not announce itself. It does not mark territory visibly. It does not leave remains. It appears briefly, then it is gone. The significance of clusters is not that they prove anything. It is that they reduce randomness. When reports repeat in the same locations across time, coincidence becomes harder to maintain. Not impossible, but strained. Clusters create the conditions for investigation without providing answers. They invite attention. They resist conclusion. They exist at the intersection of environment and perception, history and geography. By the late 20th century, certain clusters were well enough established to attract sustained interest. Not from authorities, but from individuals willing to document without declaring. Journalists, researchers, archivists, people who noticed that the same question kept returning to the same places. Not loudly, quietly, and always just far enough apart to remain unresolved. As long as clusters continue to form, the phenomenon remains unfinished. Not because it is active everywhere, but because it never fully leaves. It waits, in the same forests, along the same roads, near the same margins, until someone else sees it, and another cluster begins to take shape. The people who wrote it down. Most sightings disappear as quickly as they occur. A moment passes. A witness leaves. Nothing remains except memory. Without someone willing to record it, the encounter ends there. What separates isolated experiences from patterns is documentation. The people who began writing these encounters down were rarely believers. They were often skeptics by temperament, trained to reduce claims, not preserve them. Journalists, folklorists, law enforcement officers, scientists, archivists, they did not set out to validate a mystery. They set out to close a file. In southern Wisconsin during the early 1990s, a local newspaper reporter was assigned what seemed like a routine human interest story. Rumors were circulating about a wolfman seen along rural roads. Instead, the reporter encountered something else. Witness after witness described similar details without prompting. Not dramatic language, not folklore, descriptions of posture, height, distance, duration. Many were embarrassed. Some asked if their names could be omitted. A few refused to be interviewed on record at all. What mattered was not the claims themselves, but the consistency. The reporter began keeping notes, then files, then years passed. That pattern repeats elsewhere. In multiple regions, local officials quietly recorded reports that never reached public attention. Humane officers logged unusual animal complaints. Sheriffs took statements they could not classify. Park rangers noted encounters that did not match known wildlife behavior. These records were often informal. A paragraph in a logbook, a memo, a manila folder. One such folder, kept by a county humane officer in Wisconsin, was reportedly labeled simply werewolf, not as an endorsement of folklore but as a placeholder. The reports inside did not fit any other category. The people maintaining these records did not circulate them widely. They were not building a case. They were waiting for an explanation that never came. Folklorists encountered the phenomenon from a different angle. While studying regional legends, they noticed something unusual. Some stories did not behave like myths. They were localized, recent, specific. Names were given, dates included, roads identified. Unlike traditional folklore, these accounts did not evolve much over time. Details remained stable, the same posture, the same movement, the same silence. Folklorists began treating these not as symbolic narratives, but as contemporary experience reports. In academic contexts, this distinction matters. Legends usually change as they spread. Personal experience accounts resist alteration. The werewolf sightings fell into the latter category. Law enforcement responses were usually brief. Without physical evidence or criminal activity, cases closed quickly. But officers remembered them. Years later, when similar reports surfaced, the memory of earlier cases created unease. This has been noted repeatedly by investigators. The second report in a region is more unsettling than the first. The third changes the tone entirely. Scientists who encountered the phenomenon often did so indirectly. Psychiatrists studying delusional disorders reviewed historical cases of people who believed they transformed into animals. Neurologists examined how the brain constructs body perception. These researchers were careful to distinguish internal experience from external observation. Clinical lycanthropy, as it is known, involves belief, sensation, delusion. The witnesses in modern sightings were not claiming to transform. They were claiming to see something. That difference matters. Some scientists attempted environmental explanations. Large animals seen under unusual lighting, bears with mange, escaped exotic pets, hoaxes. Each explanation accounted for some reports. None accounted for all. This is where documentation became crucial. When descriptions align across time, geography, and witness background, coincidence becomes less comfortable. Archivists began cross-referencing reports, not to prove anything but to understand frequency, geography, clustering. They noticed the same features recurring: upright posture, canine head, human-like arms, close-range observation. The people doing this work rarely publicized it. There was little incentive. Academic risk was high. Funding non-existent. Much of the documentation exists in private collections, local archives, and personal notes. Some of it has been lost. Some of it survives only because someone considered it strange enough to keep. What unites these record keepers is not belief, but restraint. They do not embellish. They do not speculate publicly. They present what was reported and note what cannot be explained. In many cases, they actively rule things out. Hoaxes identified, misidentified animals corrected, fabrications discarded. What remains after that process is smaller but harder, a residue of reports that resist classification. The act of writing something down changes its nature. It removes it from rumor. It anchors it to time and place. Once written, an encounter can be compared. This comparison is where discomfort grows, because the people writing these accounts down expect variation. They expect inconsistency. They expect imagination to fill gaps. Instead, they find repetition. The same description written decades apart by people who never met. The same posture described in different countries by witnesses with no shared culture. The same hesitation in language. The same insistence that it was not quite one thing or another. The people who documented these encounters often express the same frustration. They are left with material that cannot be dismissed easily, but cannot be concluded either. They become custodians of uncertainty. This role is rarely comfortable. To write something down is to admit that it happened. Not that it means anything. Not that it proves anything. Only that it occurred. The individuals who did this work did not resolve the mystery. They preserved it. Without them, the phenomenon would dissolve into anecdote. With them, it remains a question that can be returned to again and again. The written record does not answer what is being seen. It does something quieter. It ensures that the encounters are not forgotten. And as long as they are not forgotten, the mystery does not end. It waits, not in the forest, but on the page, for the next incident to be added beneath the last. And eventually, someone else will write that one down too. Attempts to explain the events. Once incidents are documented, explanation follows. This is not skepticism so much as habit. Human systems are designed to classify. When something resists classification, pressure builds to resolve it. Over the past several centuries, many explanations have been proposed for upright wolf-like sightings. Some are medical, some psychological, some environmental, some sociological. None are presented here as solutions, only as attempts. One of the earliest medical explanations focused on rare genetic conditions. Congenital hypertrichosis, sometimes called werewolf syndrome, causes excessive hair growth across the face and body. Individuals with the condition were documented in Europe as early as the 1500s. Their appearance could be striking, particularly under low light. Hypertrichosis explains appearance. It does not explain posture in the forest at night, repeated sightings by different witnesses, or attacks attributed to something non-human. Another proposed explanation involves porphyria, a group of metabolic disorders known to cause photosensitivity, neurological symptoms, and psychiatric disturbances. In severe cases, teeth may appear reddish, skin may blister, and behavior may become erratic. Porphyria has been cited as a possible explanation for historical confessions. It does not account for external sightings by unrelated witnesses. The distinction matters. Medical explanations tend to address belief and appearance, not observation. Psychiatric explanations follow a similar pattern. Clinical lycanthropy is a documented condition in which individuals believe they are transforming into animals, often wolves. Brain imaging studies show disruptions in regions responsible for body perception. Patients report sensations of limbs changing, faces elongating, hair growing. These experiences are internal. They occur during psychosis, severe depression, or schizophrenia. Treatment often reduces or eliminates the belief, But modern sightings rarely involve individuals claiming to be werewolves. They involve people claiming to have seen something else. The witnesses do not report dissociation. They do not report bodily transformation. They report an external figure. Psychiatry explains conviction. It does not explain consistency across observers. Environmental explanations are often the most persuasive. Large animals seen under poor lighting can appear distorted. Bears standing on hind legs can resemble upright figures briefly. Bears with mange lose fur in patches, creating an unsettling appearance. These explanations account for some reports. They struggle with others. Bears do not typically linger near roads watching passing cars. They do not kneel. Their limb proportions differ. Witnesses familiar with wildlife often insist that what they saw did not move like a bear. Dogs and wolves can stand briefly, but sustained upright movement is rare. Size estimates in many reports exceed known canid dimensions. Hoaxes are also proposed. People in costumes, pranks, attention-seeking behavior. Hoaxes exist. They are documented. They tend to collapse under scrutiny. Details shift. Witnesses contradict themselves. Motives emerge. Clusters that span decades challenge this explanation. Hoaxes require continuity. They require participants. They leave trails. Most sightings do not. Cultural explanation is another approach. The idea that stories prime perception, that folklore creates expectation, and expectation shapes experience. This explanation works best where folklore is strong. It works less well where witnesses lack cultural exposure. Many modern witnesses report encountering the figure before ever hearing of similar stories. Some learn the term werewolf only after reporting their experience. Cultural priming explains amplification. It does not explain origin. Some researchers suggest unknown or rare animal species. A large, biped-capable canid. A relict population not yet catalogued. This explanation faces significant challenges. No remains. No confirmed specimens. No genetic material. No clear ecological niche. Centuries of encounters without physical evidence strain this theory. Others propose combinations. Misidentification combined with fear. Rare events exaggerated by memory. Environmental stressors shaping perception. These hybrid explanations are flexible. They fit around anomalies rather than resolving them. What all explanations share is partial success. Each accounts for some reports. None account for all. This is the critical point. The failure of explanation is not dramatic. It is incremental. Each theory reduces uncertainty slightly, then stops. What remains afterward is not proof of anything extraordinary. It is residue, reports that do not fit, encounters that persist after elimination. Descriptions that remain consistent despite different explanatory frameworks. Investigators who engage seriously with the phenomenon tend to arrive at the same position. Not belief, not dismissal, suspension. They rule out what they can. They note what remains. They avoid conclusion. This stance is often misinterpreted as indecision. It is not. It is methodological restraint. In most fields, unresolved cases are set aside. Attention moves elsewhere. New data replaces old. With these sightings, new data resembles the old too closely to ignore. The same posture, the same ambiguity, the same unwillingness to escalate. The attempts to explain continue. They likely always will. As science advances, new models will be proposed. new conditions identified, new environmental factors considered. Each will illuminate part of the pattern. None have yet illuminated the whole. The explanations do not end the mystery. They shape it. They define its boundaries without filling its center. What remains after explanation is not a monster, nor a diagnosis, nor a theory. It is a recurring observation that resists closure. And that resistance is what keeps the phenomenon alive, not as belief but as question. In the end, explanation does not eliminate the sightings. It circles them, and every time it comes close, something remains just out of reach, standing upright at the edge of what can be named. What the explanations leave behind. After explanations are applied, something remains. Not belief, not certainty, a remainder. It consists of reports that do not disappear when common causes are removed. Encounters that persist after misidentification is considered. Details that do not collapse into error, hoax, or pathology. These are not the most dramatic cases. They are often the quietest. They involve close distance, extended observation, multiple witnesses. They resist compression. One category that remains difficult to explain involves proximity. Many sightings occur not at a distance, but within a few meters. Witnesses describe slowing their vehicles to a near stop. Others describe standing still while the figure remains in view. These encounters last long enough for anatomy to be noticed. The bend of the legs, the way the shoulders sit, the angle of the arms. Witnesses describe joint movement rather than blur, muscle tension rather than shadow. These are not impressions formed in a split second. In several cases, witnesses report being close enough to smell the figure. The odor is described as organic, animal, sometimes decayed. This detail appears independently across reports and is rarely volunteered unless asked. Environmental explanations struggle here. Smell requires presence. Another remainder involves behavior. The figure is frequently described as aware but not reactive. It does not flee immediately. It does not charge. It does not behave like startled wildlife. It watches. In some accounts, it adjusts posture slowly, as if evaluating the situation. This is not typical predator behavior, nor is it typical prey behavior. The lack of aggression is notable. Despite centuries of sightings, modern reports rarely involve direct attacks on humans. The encounters end without escalation. The witness leaves. The figure remains or retreats. This restraint complicates threat-based explanations. If the phenomenon were purely predatory, attacks would be more consistent. If it were purely human, confrontation would be more likely. Another remainder involves clustering over time. Explanations often assume randomness, one-off errors, isolated misperceptions. Clusters challenge that assumption. When reports recur in the same region across decades, coincidence weakens. Environmental conditions change. Populations shift. Witnesses age and die. The descriptions persist. In some clusters, the gap between sightings spans years. In others, generations. The continuity does not require constant presence. It requires return. What returns is not dramatic. It is familiar enough to be recognized. Another unresolved category involves witnesses who are experienced observers. Hunters, farmers, law enforcement officers, wildlife professionals, individuals accustomed to seeing animals under poor lighting. These witnesses often begin their accounts by explaining what they ruled out. They describe bears they have seen before, wolves they have tracked, dogs they know intimately, Their uncertainty is not casual. It is reluctant. They arrive at it after elimination. There are also cases involving multiple witnesses observing the same figure simultaneously, from different angles, at different distances. Shared hallucination is rare. Coordinated misperception even more so. These reports do not prove anything. They complicate dismissal. Physical traces form another remainder. Oversized footprints, unusual gait patterns, tracks that begin or end abruptly. None are conclusive. None survive scrutiny as evidence. But their existence aligns with witness reports rather than contradicting them. If the sightings were purely psychological, physical traces would be absent entirely. They are not common, but they are present often enough to be noted. Then there is the question of continuity across cultures. The upright, wolf-like figure appears in regions with no shared mythology. In areas where the term werewolf has no cultural currency, witnesses describe the same shape using different language. The description precedes the label. This challenges the idea that folklore drives perception. Folklore may shape interpretation after the fact. It does not appear to generate the encounter itself. What remains after explanation is not a single theory. It is a pattern, a recurring form that resists reduction. This does not imply that the form represents a single entity. It does not require a biological explanation. It does not demand belief. It requires acknowledgement. Something is being seen. Not everywhere, not often, but repeatedly enough to be noticed. The failure of explanation is not absolute. Many cases are resolved. Many are misidentifications. Many are hoaxes. The phenomenon persists because a small percentage are not. These unresolved cases do not cluster around belief systems. They cluster around geography and circumstance. Rural roads, forest edges, nighttime transitions, moments when human activity thins and perception sharpens. The remainder is also defined by witness reaction. People do not typically become obsessed. They do not build identities around the encounter. Most return to their lives quietly. The experience sits with them. It does not expand. It does not evolve. It remains a single unresolved memory. This psychological profile differs from myth-making. It resembles interruption. Something occurred that does not integrate cleanly into existing categories. Years later, when asked, witnesses often say the same thing. I don't know what it was. Not I believe. Not I'm sure. Just uncertainty. Investigators who reach this stage often stop. Not because curiosity ends, but because methodology does. Without new data, there is nowhere to go. The phenomenon does not escalate to meet explanation. It recedes. It leaves behind these fragments, descriptions without conclusions, records without closure, patterns without resolution. What explanations leave behind is not evidence of the extraordinary. It is evidence of limits, limits of observation, limits of classification, limits of certainty. These limits are uncomfortable. They resist narrative satisfaction, but they are honest. The remainder does not demand an answer. It waits. It remains in the files that were never closed, in the memories that never settled, in the descriptions that continue to match, even when separated by time and place. What explanations leave behind is not a monster in the forest. It is a question at the edge of knowledge. And as long as that question continues to be returned to by new witnesses, it does not disappear. It simply stands there, upright, unresolved, and just far enough away to remain unnamed. The sightings continue. By the early 21st century, many expected the reports to fade. Forests were shrinking, roads were lit, cameras were everywhere. Satellites mapped terrain that once swallowed light. If something unusual had been present, it should have been exposed by now. Instead, the sightings changed only in frequency, not in form. They became quieter. In the years after the Bray Road cluster subsided, reports did not end. They spread outward, surrounding counties, adjacent states, isolated roads that never gained names. In 2010, a driver in rural Michigan reported seeing a tall, fur-covered figure standing at the edge of a service road shortly after midnight. He slowed, believing it to be a man. At closer range, the head shape forced him to reconsider. The figure did not react. It watched as the vehicle passed. In 2018, a hunter in northern Wisconsin reported seeing an upright animal near a tree line at dusk. He observed it through binoculars for several seconds before it moved behind cover. He did not fire. He did not follow. In 2020, a couple driving through a wooded area in Pennsylvania reported braking suddenly when a large figure stepped onto the road. It crossed on two legs, paused briefly, then disappeared into the forest. No photograph was taken. The encounter lasted less than a minute. These reports did not trend on social media. They did not produce viral footage. They appeared in small forums, local discussions, and private correspondence. Often, they appeared only because someone was looking for them. One of the quiet constants of modern sightings is hesitation. Witnesses pause before sharing. They weigh the cost of speaking against the likelihood of being dismissed. Many decide not to report at all. Those who do often say the same thing. They would not have spoken if they had not heard someone else describe something similar. The pattern continues to rely on recognition. Technology has not resolved the phenomenon. Cameras are present, but encounters are brief. Low light reduces clarity. Witnesses are often startled, not prepared. When images do surface, they are inconclusive, blurred, distant, open to interpretation. The lack of definitive evidence is often treated as resolution. It is not. It is simply absence. The landscapes associated with sightings remain largely unchanged. Forest edges, back roads, transitional spaces between human activity and quiet. These are places where attention drifts, where routine takes over, where something unexpected can enter awareness without announcement. In these places, sightings do not feel dramatic. They feel intrusive. The figure appears. It does not perform. It does not pursue. It occupies space briefly, then leaves. The witnesses return home. The encounter does not escalate into obsession. It settles into uncertainty. This is perhaps the most consistent feature of modern reports. They do not create movements. They do not inspire cult belief. They do not demand action. They remain personal. When researchers revisit earlier clusters, they often find something unexpected. Not continuity of activity, but continuity of description. A report from the 1930s reads like one from the 1990s. A description from Europe aligns with one from North America. The language changes. The shape does not. This continuity has survived wars, industrialization, mass media, and scientific advancement. Not because it is reinforced, but because it repeats. The question of why sightings continue is often framed incorrectly. The issue is not why people believe. The issue is why people keep seeing the same thing. Not exactly the same, not always in the same place, not frequently, but often enough to prevent closure. Some argue that the sightings persist because the idea persists, that stories circulate quietly and influence perception. This explanation would require consistency of exposure. Many witnesses report none. They encounter the description only after the event, while searching for language. Others argue that sightings persist because of environmental misidentification. This explanation would require variability. Instead, the descriptions remain narrow. Others argue that sightings persist because of hoaxes. This explanation would require motive. Most witnesses gain nothing. The persistence of sightings does not demand a single explanation. It demands patience. Each report on its own is insufficient. Together, they form something else. Not evidence of a creature, not proof of a myth, a record of repetition. The phenomenon does not advance toward revelation. It does not retreat into legend. It occupies a narrow band between. The sightings continue because nothing has stopped them. No definitive explanation has closed the file. No discovery has resolved the pattern. No absence has lasted long enough to end it. The reports thin out, then return. Always just often enough. There is no final incident, no concluding event, no last sighting that marks an end. Instead, there is continuity without climax. Someone sees something. Years pass. Someone else sees it again. The forests do not respond to inquiry. Roads do not keep memory. Landscapes hold no record of what passed through them. Only people do, and people are temporary. As witnesses age and die, their accounts fade unless written down. Many are not. Some survive. Those that survive read similarly. They do not argue. They do not persuade. They describe. In the end, the phenomenon does not insist on being understood. It persists without explanation, without escalation, without resolution. The sightings continue not as proof of anything, but as reminders of limits. Limits of observation, limits of certainty, limits of explanation. Whatever is being seen does not require belief to exist. It requires only a moment when someone looks up from routine and notices a shape that does not belong. A pause, a hesitation, then silence. The witness leaves. The figure is gone. The road remains. The forest remains. And somewhere else, at some other time, another person will slow their car or stop their walk or lower their rifle and realize that what they are seeing does not fit. Not because it is extraordinary, but because it refuses to settle into anything familiar. And so the record remains open, not waiting for an answer, just waiting. The history of werewolf sightings does not end with an answer. It ends with a pattern that refuses to disappear. Across centuries, cultures, and continents, people have described the same upright shape at the edge of human activity. The language has changed. The explanations have evolved. The environments have shifted. But the core description has remained remarkably stable. At different times, these encounters were treated as crimes, illnesses, superstitions, misidentifications, or hoaxes. Each framework explained part of the record. None absorbed it completely. What remains is not evidence of a creature, nor proof of a myth. It is a record of repeated observation, moments when ordinary people encountered something that did not fit their expectations of the natural world. These encounters rarely demand belief. Most witnesses do not claim certainty. They describe hesitation, confusion, and a lasting sense of incompleteness. The experience does not grow with retelling. It does not become more dramatic over time. It remains fixed, unresolved. That may be the most unsettling feature of all. The phenomenon does not behave like folklore. It does not escalate like panic. It does not resolve like investigation. It appears briefly, then withdraws, leaving behind only description. Forests still stand. Roads still cut through them. People still move between places when attention drifts and routines take over. In those moments, something is occasionally noticed. Upright, animal, familiar and unfamiliar at once. Whether these sightings represent misperception, rare natural behavior, cultural residue, or something not yet understood remains unanswered. The record does not demand a conclusion. It simply persists. Perhaps the question is not what people are seeing, but why the same shape continues to appear at the margins of certainty. Why it resists explanation without insisting on belief. The files remain open not because of mystery alone, but because of restraint. The sightings do not ask to be believed. They ask only to be remembered.